This presentation is going to focus on the social role valorization theme of unconsciousness and, relatedly, the importance of developing and maintaining consciousness. When we talk about unconsciousness, we are not talking about the state of being physically unconscious. Rather, we're talking about the mental state of being uninformed or unaware. The part of mental life that really doesn't ordinarily enter our awareness, but, and this is very important, the part of our mental life which informs how we see things and what we do. We can understand the idea of your unconscious by using this metaphor of an iceberg. So if you look at this picture of the iceberg, only part of the iceberg is visible from the surface, above the surface. What you cannot see below the surface is the enormous amount of ice that makes up most of the iceberg, which is below the water. So the tip of the iceberg represents the things that we are aware of, and the rest of the information that we have access to can be likened to the part of the iceberg that's below the surface, that we don't see, we're not fully aware of, but it's still powerful and it influences our thinking and our behavior. Let's think about the impact of unconsciousness. Unconscious thoughts, learnings, beliefs, feelings, and so forth can potentially lead to bias. They can lead to offensive actions towards other people. They can engage even in promoting and engaging in hurtful actions towards others. They can promote fear and anger and aggression without even awareness of what is being done and why it's being done. What is the root cause of our actions? I want to share an example from my own life where I had unconscious things that I had learned that were actually informing my actions, and some of the actions were hurtful to people. So I'd been trained as a special education teacher in university, and I'd been trained a certain way of providing that special education in separate classes with only students who had disabilities being put together. And I engaged in that kind of education, even though that way of delivering education, even though I saw there were some issues with it, wasn't working all that well. I kept trying and didn't realize how much of what I had learned was so embedded in my thinking unconsciously that even though it wasn't working, I kept doing it again and again until I got challenged by some people who had consciousness of what were some of the problems with providing special education in that way. Challenged by students, challenged by parents, challenged by some other teachers to open up and to think about inclusive education. And I realized that I needed to make a change. I had been sincere, but what I had been doing had not been all that helpful to the students, and in some ways I had been sincerely wrong. And so when I got those challenges and I began to open up, it changed my actions. So bias and resulting devaluation is often unconscious. Remember the definition of unconsciousness, and I was a perfect example of that. I wasn't aware that what I had learned was so deeply ingrained in me and was shaping my perceptions and shaping my behavior. And when I got challenged, then it was my aha moment, and light was shed. And I began to see things differently, my consciousness was raised, and then to do things differently, which was really good for me as well as my students. So we also need to be aware that unconsciousness occurs in all places and with all people. So unconsciousness occurs within individuals, or each one of us, within small groups of close associates of ours, within formal organizations such as school systems, universities, colleges, service systems. Unconsciousness occurs across community organizations and even across whole societies and within societies. And knowing that, I think we can safely assume that there's unconsciousness that's present within inclusive post-secondary education. Maybe there is unconsciousness about the vision of inclusive post-secondary education, about what it can be. Maybe there's unconsciousness about how some of the things that we are doing are falling short. Maybe there's unconsciousness of how we can improve and do things better. So a question that many people ask me when I'm sharing this information is, well, why? Why is there so much unconsciousness? And we'll offer some brief ideas here. One is it's just part of our human nature. That honestly, on just the level of being a human being and having limitations, we can't perceive everything around us and be conscious of it all. Much more of what goes into our minds, goes into the unconscious part of our minds, and we don't even know it's there. It's just part of human nature. Secondly, a lot of what we learn without even knowing that we learned it. So here's an example I want to share with you, which always has made this clear to me. So my daughter went to a very large high school for a while where there were about 960 students. And in that school, it was a very busy school, as you might imagine. In that school, there was one classroom for students with intellectual disabilities. That classroom was located on a hallway all by itself. There were no other classrooms on that hallway. The students always stayed in the classroom. In fact, they arrived at the school on a different bus than other students took. They also arrived at a different time, and they left at a different time from the other students, so they never encountered other students in the hallways, and went home on a different bus. The only time they might have seen some other students was in the cafeteria. And then again, they could see other students but not really engage with them because they were instructed to sit at a table all together, that one classroom of students. And so I watched their schedule, and I thought, what are the other students in this high school learning about students with intellectual disabilities just from the way things are structured? And they don't even know that they're learning something. It most likely goes into the unconscious part of their mind. So I would say the students in the high school were learning that here are students who are different from me. Here are students who can't do the same kinds of things that I can do. Here are students who can't even ride the same bus that I do. And so those can be pretty hurtful unconscious learnings to be holding to. Might come out in some behavior that would, some expression that could be quite hurtful to people with disabilities. As well, there's a lot of complexity in life, you know that. And most times when human beings are confronted with a lot of complexity, it gets overwhelming. So you may have been in a situation where there's such complex dynamics and people are trying to share the dynamics with you. And you get to the point where you say, wait, it's too much information. Just tell me, is it this way or is it this way? And typically when we get overwhelmed with complexity, that's kind of what we do. We want one way or the other. And that means that we shut out a lot of other options. It's between this way or that way. And we oftentimes are unconscious about what we've shut out. And lastly, all societies everywhere throughout history have put pressure on the members of that society to conform. And so we don't realize that oftentimes that pressure is being put on us, and we oftentimes don't realize that we're conforming. We're not aware that we're conforming and maybe conforming to beliefs that are not consistent with what we think we believe, and engaging in actions that we don't know come from our unconscious thoughts. So now let's relate this idea of unconsciousness to inclusive post-secondary education. Here would be some examples of things that you might see. So we, in a previous presentation, have talked about the negative stereotypes and the bias that come from those stereotypes of students with disabilities. And so here are some practices you might have seen. That students with disabilities in inclusive post-secondary education are physically present in classes of all kinds, engaging in and physically present in social life, but not really participating or engaging. So kind of sitting on the sidelines. Students with and without disabilities are engaging with one another, but not in typical natural kinds of ways. That the engagement is forced. I'm thinking of one example that I encountered where a friend program had been set up by, quote, friend program, by one of the initiatives to match students with disabilities and students without disabilities to be friends with each other on campus. Well, that's very unnatural. And who knows exactly what that practice comes, what kind of belief that practice comes from, but it might be that students with disabilities and even students without disabilities are just not able to come together and develop relationships without, kind of professional matching. Another way that you might see unconsciousness informing practice would be when, professors are positive about students with disabilities being in class, but they don't require that the students do any of the work, or any of the assignments, or take the tests and so forth that are part of the coursework. And so, again, that practice may be informed by some unconscious beliefs that students with disabilities are actually incapable. Another example would be students with disabilities are assumed to not really be able to learn much from classes. And so while the students may be present, but again, there's not much engagement with the students as a result of perhaps the unconscious belief that, well, it's good for the students to be there, but how much are they really going to get out of it? And in fact, I'll tell you, oftentimes families and professionals will say to me, is this really a good idea, inclusive post-secondary education? Like, what is the student with a disability going to get out of this? So in contrast, we can think about a number of areas, and I just want to remind you of two areas that it's really important to have consciousness of that can really inform our actions. The first one is, again, something that we did talk about in a previous presentation, but I want to just remind you of it, is having awareness of the culturally valued analog. And so what is the culturally valued analog? It is typical and valued practices that you would see with reasonable frequency among the students who are involved in inclusive post-secondary education in any number of places. And people would, the faculty, the students, the administrators would all be familiar with these practices, and people would think about those practices in a very positive way. We can boil this down to thinking about, are we offering students to have an experience that is the same experience that matriculated students would have? And so thinking about, how do students learn to get around the campus? How do all students learn to do that? And making sure that that learning opportunity is available for the students with disabilities in the same way with some supports if needed. How do young people who are embarking on post-secondary education learn to negotiate things with their families as a young adult? How do students learn to do that? All students. And so we would want to make available with support as is needed those same opportunities for students who are in inclusive post-secondary education. How do students learn to make decisions? All students, as they are students in post-secondary education. Who are the people who advise them? Many students take risks, right? And make mistakes, and hopefully they learn from those mistakes. So are all those possibilities open and available, the typical valued kinds of practices for students in inclusive post-secondary to learn how to make decisions? The second piece of information that I want to remind you of, that it's very helpful if we are maintaining consciousness and awareness about, is what we talked about in a previous presentation around devaluation, bias, and the resulting hurtful experiences that can be perpetrated upon people. So rejection and the stereotypes, and I've mentioned a lot this idea of being segregated and congregated and stigmatized and subjected to very low expectations and even controlled, told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and so forth. Examples that you might see in inclusive post-secondary education that we want to be aware of is where a student is alone in the midst of other students. No one is talking to or engaging with that student. Or sometimes I've seen students who are young adults being talked to as if they were children in inclusive post-secondary initiatives, with that tone of voice that you'd use with children. I've also seen another example where a student in an inclusive post-secondary education initiative was part of a social club on campus, and that student took a little bit longer to express his thoughts, and the leader of the group was afraid that this student would end up being a burden to the rest of the group and holding things up and making the meetings longer. So if we have awareness of the kinds of bias and resulting experiences that can happen for people, we can address them and we can do things differently. And I will say, you know, having an awareness of the themes and strategies that social role valorization offers to us really gives us a very powerful way to raise and maintain consciousness and practice. So, raising consciousness, here are some practical ideas. First of all, remember that all of us have unconscious bias, and that none of us are without that. Secondly, remember that people who are on the receiving end of societal devaluation and that bias pay a high price for unconsciousness and lack of awareness. So people experience things that are really hurtful and there's not awareness of them. You can ask yourself personally, am I willing to work on raising my own consciousness? It can be very humbling and very confrontational to really work on raising your consciousness. And are you willing to share any insights that you have with other people in a respectful way so that people can hear it and think about what you're sharing? And remember, this is a lifelong process. I don't think that anyone could ever say, aha, I've arrived at full consciousness. So it's a continual process. And I put the question to you, are you willing to make a commitment to engage in consciousness raising throughout your life in different life areas? And to speak up when you see bias and devaluation. That can be very hard to do. You certainly want to do it in a respectful way, in a way that will promote identification and maybe bring about some change. And are you willing to engage in study, conversations, and actually talking with people who are experiencing devaluation in a very real way and learning from people who are on the receiving end of it? And lastly, are you willing to be a role model? Because of course, you know that saying that we've all heard throughout our lives, actions speak louder than words, is really true. And oftentimes you can accomplish a lot of consciousness raising through your actions. You can make the commitment. That's what you do have control over. And I really love the way James Baldwin said this. He said, not everything that is faced can be changed. So we will see things that we become aware of that we're not able to change. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. So raising consciousness and awareness is the beginning of bringing about change. And so awareness is the great agent for change. And I hope that this short presentation of this theme of social role valorization has encouraged you to move forward in looking around in awareness. And the last thought I'd like to leave you with here is that awareness is like the sun. When it shines on things, they are transformed. And so in conclusion, here are some questions to consider. Am I open to learning about bias and devaluation and its subtle expressions that can exist in inclusive post-secondary education? Do I have a good understanding of the values, the vision, and best practices of inclusive post-secondary education? And again, I ask you, am I willing to engage in consciousness raising? And am I willing to act once my consciousness has been raised? So thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope it will really strengthen you and encourage you in your efforts for inclusive post-secondary education.